Yes, so can you give us your reflections a bit more broadly on that event? As you say, tomorrow is 2 years on. There are still dozens of hostages that remain, so much loss of life since, but the reverberations have been felt worldwide as well, haven't they?
Well, they have, Kieran. I mean, what happened 2 years ago was unthinkable. I was there with Boris Johnson and Danny Danon, who's now the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, and we were there about a month after the attacks. We saw the devastation, we saw the bullet holes on the walls, we saw the blood on the walls, we saw where the atrocities took place. It was completely and utterly unimaginable what took place. And it's important that we remember October 7, the single largest massacre of Israelis for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, all in one day. And so remember October 7, I think, is really important. We all pledged many, many years ago, post-war, to never again. Well, sadly, we've seen it again. And you talk about the broader reverberations, and I think we've seen that here in the West, particularly we've seen it here in Australia. We've seen the ugly spectre of anti-Semitism rise up in a way that, frankly, I never, ever thought I would see in this country. I know that the absolute heartbreak that is felt by the Jewish community in Australia, a community that has contributed so much to the country. The fact that they cannot feel safe in their own country is just an unthinkable thing for any Australian, and for the Jewish community to suffer that here in Australia. And I think that the vacuum that has been left open for these anti-Semitic issues and feelings and demonstrations and statements to arise, I'm just devastated by it. But I can't approach the devastation that those in the Jewish community feel. But it's not just here. It's all around the West. It's tied up in other sort of causes and issues that sort of seek to denounce the West. And I think that's part of a bigger problem that we're facing with Western civilization.
Well, we saw it all too clearly, didn't we, tragically, over the last few days in Great Britain. Again, you said rightly that this country, this nation has been built in part by our wonderful Jewish community. The Jewish community in Britain's got a wonderful history too, a very large community, and sadly, the subject of a terrible attack in Manchester.
Yeah, the Manchester attack, I mean, it's just hard to imagine these things taking place. I mean, we had a firebombing of a synagogue in Melbourne. That is impossible to imagine. The fact that Jewish people cannot go to their places of worship and pray and worship and enjoy the fellowship of community in a democracy, in a Western state that says it respects all religions, that it respects all peoples, I think is a tragic failing of what is occurring at the moment. It would seem that such rights, such opportunities to worship in peace and freedom are not extended to all, and I'm sure that the Jewish community doesn't feel it extends to them at the moment. I must admit, when I was Prime Minister and we significantly increased the funding we were putting in security, it always broke my heart that we had to have security around synagogues in Australia. I grew up in actually the eastern suburbs of Sydney, grew up with many in the Jewish community, and I was always surprised that I could go to a church on a Sunday with my family, but friends who would go to synagogues, there'd be security guards standing outside. There'd be security guards at Jewish childcare centres. I mean, that should say something to us about what is happening in our society and how it's up to all of us to ensure that anti-Semitism is sent back to the dungeons where it belongs.
Can I ask you about the way the Greens leader yesterday was on the ABC and was asked about anti-Semitism and these broader issues and kept pivoting back to why we should be having embargoes on Israel and not sending weaponry or parts to Israel, as opposed to dealing with the anti-Semitism in and of itself. Can you explain to me your reaction to that? Is that part of the problem here, where there's this conflation between issues at home and abroad?
Well, it fails to take responsibility for what one is doing in one's own country. and political leadership in this country, in what is a multicultural society, can't pick and choose when it comes to freedom of religion. It can't pick and choose when it comes to freedom of worship, and to ensure that all Australians have those rights and those opportunities, I think, is critically important. I mean, I remember when I was still in the Parliament, and the Greens were holding the views and projecting the views. They're entitled to them. We're a free country, but that doesn't mean that I have to share them or think they offer anything of merit. I think they offer nothing of merit, and it's a bit of a cop-out, I think, to try and shift the issue, as I think the Greens have done. But it is. I understand that Australians and many in the West are heartbroken when they see the devastation of what's been occurring in Gaza. I think it's one of the things of our modern times that these days we are more witnesses to what the horrors of war are. I can only imagine what it would have been like in the Second World War if people had seen the bombing of Dresden, and indeed there'd been the opportunity at the very time when it came to Nagasaki or Hiroshima. I mean, war is horrible. We must do all we can to prevent wars, but you don't prevent wars through appeasement. And the caravan of appeasement that we've seen in relation to the atrocities of October 7 and the quickness I've seen from so many to gloss over it and move past it, I think is a great misfortune. And as we go into October 7 tomorrow, I think it's very important that we soberly reflect on where all this began, and it must come to an end. And I think I commend President Trump for what he's done to try and bring that to an end. And there's a lot of talk about Nobel Prizes and all of that. Well, there's been plenty of people who've got Nobel Prizes. I can tell you, if President Trump pulls this one off, I can think of no more worthy recipient.
On the PNG treaty, as I said, you were there a couple of weeks ago for the 50th anniversary of independence. You're friends with Prime Minister Marape. He's in Canberra right now. They're going to sign it, that treaty, that defence treaty, in the next half hour. News conference with the Prime Ministers at midday. How big a win is this for Australia? I shouldn't say Australia alone, but PNG too. But how significant is this step forward?
I believe it is significant. To be honest, I didn't harbour the concerns about this not completing that were whizzing around up in Port Moresby a little while ago. And I mean, I'd spoken to Prime Minister Marape, as I said. I know James very, very well, and I commend James on his leadership in initiating this, in bringing this forward. This is a PNG initiative which Australia has rightfully, I think, adopted. I think we have to be very mindful of what the obligations are that come from this treaty. It is a treaty. It will go through the treaty processes of the Parliament. And we have a big nation to defend, and that will now impose additional obligations in terms of how we live out this treaty, and in terms of what we need to be doing in and around Papua New Guinea and how we can respond. That can have implications for capabilities and all of these things, all of which I think are necessary for ensuring peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region and the South-West Pacific more broadly. I think strategically it's very important, because what Papua New Guinea is saying is, when it comes to issues of security and defence, it knows who its partners are. And Papua New Guinea is a leading Melanesian nation in the Southwest Pacific, and I think that message is very, very important. And so, James is a very person of very strong beliefs and convictions. I mean, we saw that, frankly, in the issue we were just discussing. Papua New Guinea stood firm with Israel in the United States, whereas Australia went in completely other direction. So he means what he says, James Marape. I think he's a very decent Prime Minister, and I greatly appreciated the relationship with him, and I commend him and Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, for the relationship they've been able to form. It's very good for the region, and I wish the treaty all the best.
And the last one before you go, one without notice, we had arranged to just talk foreign policy, but it would be remiss of me not to ask you about Peter Dutton's comments reported by the Nine papers, laying significant blame for the election loss at the feet of Andrew Hastie. What do you make of that, suggestions that Mr Hastie had gone on strike during the campaign.
Nice try, Kieran, but those issues are well behind me. But I obviously want to see the Liberal Party focusing on the things that can ensure that it can return to government in the future. And I wish them all the best with that task.
And Susan Lee, do you think she's getting a fair crack at it?
I particularly draw people's attentions to the speech that Susan gave to CEDA quite recently. Yeah, there's all sorts of noise going on around about politics and so on, but Susan was making some very important points about what type of economy do we want to have. Do we want to have an economy that's actually driven by the hard work and the enterprise of Australians and Australian businesses and enterprises? Or do we want to have an Australian Australian economy that is basically enabled by the rent of the government? I mean, do we want a renter economy or do we want to own an economy as Australians? And I think where we're at presently suggests some very big challenges on that front, and Australians have big choices to make. And I think Susan's laying those out very well. And obviously it's challenging when there are other competing issues out there, but for attention. But I think what Susan is particularly laying out on the economy and has continued on the policies of the coalition on security and defence. I think these are the core issues that the Liberals and Nationals have always stood for, and I'd encourage them to focus on them.
Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, as I say, we were just scheduled to talk foreign policy. Thanks for taking the ones on without notice. We'll talk to you soon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Kieran.